Spell out, Claire, why marriage isn't for you.
Well, I think we did talk about it at the beginning of our relationship. We got together 8.5 years ago, and we did know at that point that we were a good, secure unit together. But just as the years went on, increasingly, I just felt I'm not a wife. I just didn't feel like I'd ever feel comfortable with that name. I just didn't feel like Matt was my husband. I felt like we were partners, and for that reason, you know, that's why we'd really like to have a civil partnership rather than a marriage.
Spell out, Claire, why marriage isn't for you.
Well, I think we did talk about it at the beginning of our relationship. We got together 8.5 years ago, and we did know at that point that we were a good, secure unit together. But just as the years went on, increasingly, I just felt I'm not a wife. I just didn't feel like I'd ever feel comfortable with that name. I just didn't feel like Matt was my husband. I felt like we were partners, and for that reason, you know, that's why we'd really like to have a civil partnership rather than a marriage.
So why aren't there civil partnerships for different sex couples at the moment when there are for same-sex couples?
It's a good question, and one we should ask the government, really. It seems to us a very logical extension of where we are now, and we have the backing of MPs from every single political party on this matter. Over 70,000 people have signed a petition. Today, the London Assembly unanimously voted in favour of extending civil partnerships to mixed-sex couples, so the momentum is there, and we're just waiting, really.
On the other hand, when there is marriage available to same-sex couples in England, Wales and Scotland, not Northern Ireland as it stands, why can they still have civil partnerships? Should they coexist?
Well, I think that when the law was extended so that same-gendered couples could have a marriage, not all of those couples actually decided that that's what they wanted, and we saw last year 1,000 people still opted to have a civil partnership even though marriage was available to them as a same-gender couple. So there's obviously demand for this even though same-gender couples can get married now.
Matt, is there another way of ensuring that you have rights equal with a married couple without having to go through marriage or indeed a civil partnership? Could that be a law change here?
I mean, I think that is something that has to be looked at, and I know that there have been debates in Parliament on the idea of a cohabitation law to cover couples who move in together, and then there's this sort of assumption that you get a common law marriage, but sadly doesn't exist. But for us as well, it's also about how we express our relationship, and that wouldn't necessarily be covered by a cohabitation law. That's why we're campaigning for the extension of civil partnerships.
Nearly 1,000 happy couples entered into civil partnerships in the UK last year, and all with one thing in common. Every one was a same-sex couple. Now the Prime Minister says mixed-sex couples can have civil partnerships too. But that's only after this couple dragged the government all the way to the Supreme Court and won.
It's fantastic that the Prime Minister has publicly and explicitly committed to extending civil partnerships to all. But obviously what's missing from this announcement is details about when and how.
Why do you want to have a civil partnership rather than a marriage?
You know, there are lots of reasons why people might not want to marry. They might have had a bad previous experience of their own marriage or their parents' marriage. They might be put off by the prohibitive cost of getting married. Or, like us, they might have some reservations about some of the symbols of marriage, some of the cultural baggage around marriage.
Why do you want to have a civil partnership rather than a marriage?
You know, there are lots of reasons why people might not want to marry. They might have had a bad previous experience of their own marriage or their parents' marriage. They might be put off by the prohibitive cost of getting married. Or, like us, they might have some reservations about some of the symbols of marriage, some of the cultural baggage around marriage.
So you know you can have a civil partnership. Have you set a date yet?
When the government has set a date for the first civil partnership, then we'll be in a position to set a date for when we might be able to finally have ours.
There are 3.3 million unmarried cohabiting couples in the UK. For those who don't want to get married, civil partnerships offer the same legal and financial rights, tax breaks, property and pension rights on separation, and benefits like the bereavement support payment. For those who don't want to get married, civil partnerships offer the same legal and financial rights, tax breaks, property and pension rights on separation, and benefits like the bereavement support payment. Lawyers now want the government to protect cohabiting couples.
Either they decide not to get married or are unable to get married or enter into a civil partnership when it comes into play, or they believe they have rights because they are common law wife or common law husband, and those rights do not exist.
It was once thought that same-sex marriage would supersede civil partnerships. Instead, more couples seem to want them. Carl Dinnan, ITV News.
A civil partnership is a legally recognised union between a couple of the same sex. It follows a different regime to marriage, and it's dealt with under the Civil Partnership Act 2004. So a civil partnership commences when both parties sign the civil partnership document, whereas a marriage can only be entered into when parties say their vows, so spoken words to each other. So civil partnership and marriage tend to have very similar rights. There are a few differences. One is in relation to pension schemes. So if one of the parties that's part of the civil partnership passes away, the other civil partner may not receive the full entitlement in terms of survivor benefits from the pension scheme that they would if they were married. There's also differences in terms of travel provisions. So some countries don't recognise civil partnerships. So if couples live abroad, they may have different rights in the country that they're living in to the rights that they'd have in England as civil partners. So the dissolution of civil partnership is very similar to divorce proceedings, other than we use different words, slightly different words. So we say that we're dissolving the civil partnership rather than referring to divorce proceedings. One of the main differences is that a civil partner can't use adultery as one of the reasons for the dissolution, whereas that can be used in divorce proceedings.